Welcome, everyone, to Election Integrity, Preventing the Coming Crisis in the 2020 Election, a joint event held by the Lynde and Harry Bradley Foundation and the Heritage Foundation. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. In a few short months, Americans will cast their ballot in what really does seem to be the most consequential election of our time. The integrity of our election system should always be protected. But with so much at stake, we must be more vigilant than ever to ensure the integrity and the safety of every person's vote. We're witnessing massive challenges to statutory election procedures in state after state across the country. We'll discuss those challenges and, in particular, what you can do to help where you live and vote. Before getting started, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Our session will be recorded and available within 48 hours, and we encourage questions, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box on the webinar dashboard. I'm very pleased to introduce three outstanding panelists who will discuss the threats and tangible action items needed to keep our elections fair and free. And since time is very short, I'll keep those introductions real short. We're joined first by Hans von Spakovsky, a senior legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. As manager of Heritage's Election Law and Reform Initiative, Hans studies and writes about campaign finance restrictions, voter fraud and voter ID, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, administration of elections, and voting equipment standards. Also with us is J. Christian Adams, president and general counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation and the founder of the Election Law Center. Christian served from 2005 to 2010 in the voting section at the United States Department of Justice. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Injustice, Exposing the Racial Agenda of the Obama Justice Department, which examines the department's election and voting rights record. Finally, please welcome Rick Essenberg, the founder and current president and general counsel of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, or WIL. Under Rick's leadership, WIL has grown into one of the most active state-based think tanks and litigation centers in the country. Rick is a frequent litigator in state and federal courts and a nationally recognized scholar and commentator on constitutional law, particularly the First Amendment's guarantees of freedom of speech and religion. So thanks to all of you for being here. Let's jump right in and start with Hans, who will provide an overview of the 2020 challenges to election integrity and how those factors may play out in the November elections. Hans, over to you.
Rick, thank you very much, and it's an honor to be on a panel with such great people, two experts I've known for a long time on this issue. You know, there was a lot of litigation and controversy in 2000 in Florida over the counting of ballots and who would be president. And since then, we've seen a big increase in litigation intended to affect the rules governing elections and the administration of elections. But this year, we've seen an explosion of litigation that I have never seen in my entire 3 decades working in this area. At the last count, there's something like 150 lawsuits that have been filed all over the country trying to change how we conduct the election in November. And the main thing that's being pushed is the idea that we should switch to an all-mail election because supposedly it's too dangerous for people to vote in person because of the COVID-19 health crisis. The problem with that, of course, is that, first of all, just very quickly, look, the difference between absentee ballots and all-mail elections is this. 45 states, you can vote by absentee ballot, and no one disputes that we need those for people who are physically disabled or sick or otherwise can't make it to the polls. 5 states, unfortunately, have switched to all-mail elections in which they simply mail an absentee or mail-in ballot to all registered voters. And the push that is going on is to basically force the 45 other states, the District of Columbia, to switch to what those 5 states are doing. Here's the problem with that, and there's 2. First of all, absentee or mail-in ballots are the ballots most vulnerable to everything from being stolen out of people's mailboxes to being altered, forged, and they subject voters to being pressured, coerced, and intimidated by campaign staffers, party activists, and political guns for hire. Why is it? Well, because they are voted outside the supervision of election officials and outside the observation of poll watchers. And remember, transparency is very, very important to maintaining the integrity of our election process. Look, every state has laws against electioneering. That means the candidates can't show up at your polling place and pressure you to vote for them. Those rules, unfortunately, don't apply in people's homes. So we see when we look at the election fraud that occurs, and despite what you may read in the New York Times or Washington Post, we do have, unfortunately, election fraud in this country. In fact, the Supreme Court back in 2008, when it upheld Indiana's voter ID law, said the U.S. has a long history of voter fraud that's been documented by journalists and historians. We just added 6 new voter fraud cases, proven cases, to our database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation. We now have 1,296 proven cases from across the country. This is not a comprehensive list, it's just a sampling of cases. The largest number of cases of one kind of fraud in that database involve absentee ballots. And again, it's because of the vulnerabilities that I've just discussed. Look, right now, the results in Paterson, New Jersey are in question. They switched to an all-mail election for the municipal election a couple of weeks ago. And there's already been 4 individuals there arrested and criminally charged with engaging in voter fraud. And 2 of the candidates now apparently have agreed to a new election because they can't really determine who won because of the many problems there. Aside from the fraud problem, we have another issue, which is with an all-mail election, you are basically handing over a very valuable commodity ballot and something very important, elections, to the U.S. Postal Service. Anyone who thinks that's a good idea should realize this. In reports filed by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, they file a report with Congress every 2 years after every federal election. In the last 4 federal elections, almost 3 million absentee or mail-in ballots were misdelivered. 1.3 million were rejected. In other words, voters got the ballots, filled them out, sent them back to election officials, and then they were rejected by election officials for not complying with the various state law standards, and the ballots were not counted. Over 28 million ballots are, the status of them is unknown, unaccounted for. In other words, election officials put them in the mail to voters who'd requested them, and then they never had another word. Yeah, it's very possible the voters who had requested the ballots decided they didn't want to vote them, but we don't really know because they're unaccounted for. Anyone who doubts this is a problem, just look at the most recent primaries held in Wisconsin, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and in New York. There are verified reports out of all of those states of thousands of individuals not receiving the ballots that they had requested. The IG for the Postal Service issued a report just recently about Wisconsin's April 7th primary, about thousands of ballots that were found in a mail processing facility after the election had never been delivered to voters. That is a continuing problem. 2 other things about this. The idea that we can't vote in person is simply not the case. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, which, as you know, is the federal agency that's on top of dealing with health crises in this country, including COVID-19, at the end of June issued a document that is guidelines for holding in-person elections. And if you do the health safety protocols that they recommend, it's everything we're seeing when we go shopping at our grocery stores: line spacing for voters, wearing masks, use of disposable materials like disposable pens to mark ballots. We can safely vote in person. We know it can be done because, in fact, Wisconsin on April 7th held its primary election. Yes, many more people did vote by mail and had problems doing so, but also several 100,000 Wisconsin residents showed up at their polls to vote. The CDC also issued another report just recently about that election, indicating that there was no spike in COVID-19 infections. Why? Because Wisconsin followed all the recommended health and safety procedures that have been recommended by healthcare experts. The final thing on this is this. The push in the litigation and the bills that have been proposed, for example, on the House side, all trying to push us to all-mail elections, also are pushing to get rid of the basic security protocols in place to try to ensure people don't cheat. The House bill, for example, that Nancy Pelosi pushed, would have said that no voter ID requirements could be applied to voting in the November election. They've been pushing for things like getting rid of witness signature requirements for absentee ballots. They've been trying to legalize vote harvesting all over the country, overriding state laws that ban vote harvesting. For those of you who don't realize what that is or understand what that means, it's this. Look, if you vote by absentee or mail-in ballot, you can mail the ballot back, trusting the Postal Service to deliver it. You can deliver it yourself, or a member of your family can. But other individuals, third parties, are generally banned from doing that, except in states that have legalized vote harvesting, in which they're saying anybody can show up at your front door and pick up your ballot to deliver it. That means that candidates, campaign staffers, party activists, political consultants, people who have a stake in the outcome of the election, have the ability to come get your ballot, pressure you to vote a particular way, and then supposedly deliver your ballot. Anyone who thinks that's a good idea, take a look. 2 years ago, the only contested congressional race in the country, North Carolina 9, that election was overturned because of illegal vote harvesting, and the vote harvesters, many of whom were criminally charged and indicted, were doing everything from stealing people's ballots to forging signatures to filling in the ballots for voters. Now, it doesn't make much sense to say that you're trying to deal with COVID-19 when you want to legalize allowing strangers to go from door to door to door to pick up people's ballots. I can't think of a faster way of trying to spread COVID-19. So you can see that there are ulterior motives there. We can all vote in person in November. We should insist on it. People who are highest at risk perhaps should vote by absentee ballot. And I would leave you just with this thought about the unreliability of having the Postal Service try to deliver tens of billions of ballots. If you won the Powerball lottery, would you be willing to put your ticket in the mail to send to the lottery agency, or would you want to deliver it in person the same way you want to be able to vote in person and you put your ballot into the ballot box? I think most people would answer that no, they wouldn't trust the US mail to deliver their lottery ticket, and ballots and the ability to vote in this country are just as valuable a commodity. Thanks, Rick.
Thanks, Hans, for those great comments. Let's turn now to Christian for an overview of how the left is deploying resources this cycle to challenge election laws and in the process threaten the integrity of our upcoming election. Christian, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for working on this great event. There's been some sobering data out of Nevada, which I will get to later in my talk. But first, there's really two things I want to mention about how the left is deploying resources. The first is that they're trying to change the laws. Now, remember, we have laws in this country about elections so the democratic process can govern the rules. In other words, legislatures meet, they pass laws, governors sign those laws, we follow those laws. But all across the country, for example, in places like Virginia, state boards and election officials are just suspending those laws. And they're suspending them under pressure. For example, the postmark requirement, the delivery date requirement. These laws are being suspended by government officials without a democratic process. One of the reasons they are is because of the enormous pressure being put on them by the left. The left has funding streams that have been activated this year that stagger the imagination. The left has always known that process, when I say process, I mean the rules of the election, determines policy. Policy is downstream from process. If you care about policy, care about process. And the left has known that for a long time. I think conservatives are waking up to that by virtue of the number of people participating in this webinar today. But for a long time, it was mostly the left that was focused on this. So what is happening in 2020? Pardon me. A huge number of groups with deep, deep pockets. When I say deep, I don't mean $100,000. I don't mean $1 million. I don't even mean $10 million. I mean hundreds of millions of dollars are fueling the effort to alter process. Who are they? Of course, everybody knows Soros and Open Society, but it's much more sophisticated than that. There's things such as Wellspring Financial, Arabelle Advisors, Democracy Fund, this network of groups that cycle money and do things with it, including fund litigation. But I want to alert you to something even more conniving than I think anybody on this call thought possible. Back in the spring, the civil rights groups, the donors had a lot of chatter about a new idea. And what was that new idea? Let's take our surplus of philanthropy and let's start giving it directly to governments, directly to election officials, so they can do what they want. If the legislature doesn't have vote by mail, if the state board of elections doesn't do something the way they want, let's just give it to a local election office, and we can be on the ground that way. Now that sounds ridiculous. That sounds like something I don't think anybody had thought of 2 years ago, was the left-wing philanthropic streams directly funding government election offices. Well, just when you think you can't make this stuff up, comes a report that they're doing it in Wisconsin. The Center for Technology and Civic Life, a 501c3 that before this year had a budget of about $900,000, has donated $6.8 million to 4 Wisconsin governments, county election offices in Milwaukee, Madison, Racine, Green Bay, epicenters of their get out the vote desires. So they're pouring millions of dollars into what I call an outside-inside strategy. The influencers on the outside pay the people on the inside. Now, who's on top of this? Virtually nobody, because nobody saw this coming. But this is something that the civil rights groups, the philanthropic streams earlier this year spent a great deal of time talking about. How extensive is it? I don't know. Is it taking place in Michigan? It would seem that would be a hardy target for them to do. But that is something that the left is doing to influence the process. Is it illegal? No. You can, a 501c3 can give money to the government. It's just nobody's usually that ridiculous that they want to fund the government. But that's what's happening in 2020, so they can get their particular boots on the ground inside the government apparatus. Okay, so one of their top priorities is mail-in voting. And it sounded great in the springtime, didn't it, when COVID was getting out of control? Well, then reality set in. And we now have data, real numbers, on how well vote by mail works. For example, the Public Interest Legal Foundation just got information from Nevada. If you've seen that circulating in the media, that was a FOIA that we'd been working on. Clark County, Nevada sent out 1.3 million ballots, and only 300,000 came back. 223,000 were returned as undeliverable. And I'm sorry, of those 303,000 that came back were counted, 7,000 were actually rejected before that. So 7,000 people lost the right to vote, were disenfranchised, and probably don't even know it in there. Washoe County, which is Reno. Reno had a similar problem where hundreds and hundreds of ballots were 27,640 rejected as undeliverable. Okay, so the question is, what can you do about this? Well, first of all, understand the reality that the voter rolls are a mess. And if you mail out ballots to people in mass, you run into problems. We sued Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. We built a database nationwide of all the various problems that exist, and we're able to see where you have problems. Pennsylvania, for example, a fellow by the name of Rashawn Slade was registered to vote 7 times, active registrations in Pittsburgh. And he did this just before the 2016 election. So mail ballots are an integral part of what the left wants to do. And while they're busy violating the rules, suspending the laws, it's an integrated strategy to use their philanthropy to affect the outcome of the election. After this webinar, you're going to have the opportunity to get materials that are being sent out by Heritage and Bradley. In those materials are some great photographs I'm including of all the undeliverable ballots in Nevada. And you can see them stacked up, laying on the ground in apartment complexes, just sitting there out in the open in public places. That's not how we want to elect people to high office in this country. So with that, I thank you all for your time. And please, if you do anything this year, please consider serving as an election official. Your county needs you, and that's the best way you could probably help out. So back to you, Rick, on that.
Thanks so much, Christian. Really frightening to hear some of those comments. Another reminder to please send in your questions. We've got quite a few questions already, and we will have some time at the end to respond to those questions. At this time, let me now call upon Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty President and General Counsel Rick Essenberg to discuss how his organization is working to protect election integrity on the ground in Wisconsin, obviously a key swing state. Rick.
Well, thank you, Rick. It's an honor to be on this panel, particularly with Hans and Christian, whose work I have admired and learned from for many years. The perspective that I want to bring is one of being a litigator on the ground with respect to some of the efforts that Christian described. I agree that we should not, and we will not, go to a mail-in election in which a live ballot is distributed to everyone who's on the registration rolls. I agree that we should not cancel in-person voting. We resisted that in Wisconsin, took some litigation the day before the election to make that happen. And as Hans pointed out, we did not have the COVID explosion that everyone had predicted, notwithstanding the fact of the city of Milwaukee in particular, which unintentionally or intentionally decided to sabotage by the election by holding open 5 polling places for a city of over 600,000 people. Nevertheless, we managed to get through the election. But here's the thing. We are going to have substantial voting by mail this fall. 34 states in the District of Columbia, including virtually every swing state, permits no excuse absentee balloting. And there's every reason to think that voters are going to take advantage of that. Here in Wisconsin in 2016, about 27% of the votes were cast absentee. And that's consistent with the national average for that election cycle. But last spring, amidst fear of the pandemic, over 70% of voters cast their ballot absentee, and almost all of them cast them by mail. And having done it once, we're going to see it happening again. And so our focus has been accepting the fact that a lot of ballots are going to get cast by mail, whether we like it or not. How do we preserve the safeguards that are in place? Now, Christian described some litigation which is attempting to do away with those safeguards, and organizations like mine and organizations like Christian's actively resist those things in court. I wanted to just highlight 2 efforts that we've made in Wisconsin to actually enforce those safeguards, because it seems to me important that we be on the offensive as well as the defensive. Here's the first one. Hans and Christian, I think, both alluded to the fact that we do a very, very poor job of maintaining the registration rolls. Pew Center estimates that 1 in 8 voter registrations are outdated or substantially inaccurate. That's about 24 million people. And it doesn't take fraud for that to happen. Most of us, when we move, we don't contact our municipal officials and tell them that we've moved. Our names remain registered at the wrong address. And so for that reason, Wisconsin, like many other states, have enacted legal safeguards to require the rolls to be cleaned up. Now, one in particular has to do with removing movers from the list. Wisconsin law requires that if an election official has learned that it is likely that a voter has moved, has reasonable information, reasonable indicator that a voter has moved, then the election official has a duty. It's a mandatory duty. You send that voter a notice the voter has 30 days to either say, no, I haven't moved, I still live at this address, or the voter's registration will be deactivated, and a postcard is generally provided to permit that to happen. This past spring, actually last fall, the Wisconsin Election Commission announced that it would not comply with that rule. And it would not comply with that rule in conjunction with data that the state of Wisconsin itself pays for and receives. It belongs to a consortium called the Election Registration Information Center, often referred to as ERIC. And ERIC generates a movers list, which consists of the identity of voters who themselves have provided information to a government agency indicating that he or she does not live at the address at which they're registered. We have found that this list is overwhelmingly accurate. It ought to trigger the mailing of one of these postcards in order to clean up the voter rolls, but the Wisconsin Election Commission has decided that it's not going to do that. It's going to allow these voters to remain on the rolls through the 2020 election and beyond. So we did what we do. We filed a lawsuit last November against the Wisconsin Election Commission, seeking to compel them on behalf of a number of Wisconsin voters to follow the law. We were initially successful. We received an order from a circuit court judge ordering the commission to comply with the law. The commission refused to do that. They voted 3-3 on partisan grounds and couldn't break the deadlock. The circuit court actually held them in contempt of court. And I've been practicing law for a long time. Don't let my youthful appearance fool you. I have never had to have anybody held in contempt of court before, but I did for the first time. But unfortunately, a court of appeals in Madison, Wisconsin reversed the circuit court decision. The Wisconsin Supreme Court has now accepted that case, and it will be argued next month, and we'll find out whether the voter rolls have to be cleaned up or not. The second project that we've undertaken has to do with something that Hans described called ballot harvesting. Now, ballot harvesting is legal in California, it's illegal in many states, and in many other states, it's of uncertain validity. Wisconsin may fall into that category. We believe that the law, properly read and interpreted, prohibits ballot harvesting, but many others, including staff at the Wisconsin Election Commission, have taken the position that ballot harvesting is permissible. And as Hans described, it is an occasion for political sin. We have political activists requesting ballots on behalf of voters, delivering them to voters, talking to voters about who they should vote for, and then deciding whether or not to return the ballots once they've been filled out. What could go wrong with a process like that? We filed a rules petition with the Wisconsin Election Commission asking them to read the law in what we believe is the proper way and to make clear that ballot harvesting is not permitted in the swing state of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Election Commission consists of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans by design. It's split 3-3. You can guess what the partisan breakdown was, but it was a partisan breakdown. And so we don't have that clarification from the Wisconsin Election Commission. We will go into the cycle. I cannot tell you, I cannot guarantee you that litigation will ensue, but I would think that it's likely that litigation will ensue, but this time it will be an attempt to enforce what I believe is a proper interpretation of the law, and that is that ballot harvesting is not permitted in our state, and I don't think it should be prohibited in any state. I'll leave you with this. I've described a couple of projects that we've undertaken here now in August of 2020. I've been doing this long enough to know that things will happen between now and Election Day that none of us anticipated, and that will require an immediate response. So when you ask what you can do, I think the most important thing is to be vigilant, to work with groups like ours, and I am sure that it will be a very interesting couple of months, so stay tuned. Rick, I'll give it back to you.
Thanks so much, Rick, and to Hans and Christian for those great comments. But let's begin the conversation part of our program today by asking each of you to consider the end game this year. What's the best scenario for this general election, And on the other hand, what's the worst case scenario? Who wants to kick it off?
Well, I'll do it just very quickly. Look, the best case scenario is that election officials realize that people have a right to vote in person, and they do everything they can, from recruiting poll workers, trying to dampen down the paranoia about that, perhaps even doubling the pay to get some of these young people who are out of college or having trouble finding jobs to work, and get as many polling places open as possible. And they do not, what we don't want to have happen, and this is the worst case scenario, what we don't want to have happen is what happened in the District of Columbia, for example, when they held a primary some weeks ago. They encouraged everyone to vote by absentee ballot and decided, well, because everybody would be voting through the mail, they would reduce the number of open polling places from their normal 100 to only 20. And then, of course, what happened was many of the absentee ballots have been requested, were not delivered. And so people who had requested the ballots showed up at their polling places to vote, and they had very long lines. People had to wait for hours to try to vote. And what we need is polling places open, as many of them as possible for what you would have for a regular election. Yeah, health safety protocols in place, and not a huge increase in or a switch to universal mail-in elections.
Christian?
Well, I hate to disagree slightly with my good friend and colleague Hans about the worst case scenario, but I think he'll agree with me when I say that the worst case scenario is Speaker Pelosi becoming president of the United States temporarily. And here's how that works.
Right.
If this election is not resolved in sufficient time, the Constitution has a provision where the Speaker of the House, which Nancy Pelosi currently is, would become the president of the United States until the election can resolve. And I think that's something that nobody who, put aside the fact that it's Nancy Pelosi for a minute, nobody who believes in the stability of our Constitution, despite their faith in the founders in putting that provision in there, wants to see it activated.
Well, look, I just very quickly, I agree with that, although it's a statutory provision, but that is highly likely if, in fact, we have a huge increase in mail elections. Just look at what happened in New York. New York, it's taken them 6 weeks since the end of June primary to try to count ballots. 6 weeks, and you don't have as much turnout in a primary as you do in a general election. And not only are the results being contested, but 1 in 5 ballots were rejected. An extremely high disenfranchisement rate, much higher than for in-person voting.
Rick?
Yeah, I think that the best case scenario, putting aside who you want to win the election, is that the public have confidence in the results. We live in a polarized country, and one of the reasons that we do what we do and ensure that the rule of law is followed is because participants in the game, and an election is in some ways a game, will have the most confidence in it when everyone adheres to the rules that have been agreed upon in advance. So I think it's absolutely essential, particularly if we have a lot of mail voting, that these safeguards remain in place. Doing away with them is not the proper way to go. I am a little bit optimistic in the sense that I think our experience here in Wisconsin did show that it's possible to do this. Remember, we went from a normal election to an election that was affected by COVID during the process of early voting, right? We started early voting and nobody thought much about COVID at all. And by the time it came around on April 7th, we were at the height of the COVID scare. And nevertheless, with some notable exceptions, I mentioned the city of Milwaukee, municipal officials were able to do this. The post office was able to do this. We were able to have in-person voting. Nobody got sick. And so when we are told that we have to abandon the rule of law because all of these horrible things will happen if we don't, I would offer my state, Rick's state, as an example that this simply isn't true. We can do this, And we did it once before under a difficult situation, and in a much easier situation and much more lead time, we can do it again, and we can do it across the country.
Agreed. And we had another primary election in Wisconsin just last week. I voted in person and it was entirely safe. The safeguards were in place. It was well done. And again, no reports of problems whatsoever. We've got about 15 or 20 minutes left for audience questions, and let's jump in there. We've got a great number of questions from the audience that unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them. But let's start with this really good question from Sarah, and she asked, do you theorize that the left strategy for pushing mail voting is a turnout strategy? In other words, increasing turnout for a low enthusiasm candidate such as Vice President Biden? Or on the other hand, a strategy to destabilize trust in the election outcome for the purposes of litigation? Christian?
Let me take a stab at that. Here's what I think. I was on a talk show today talking about this possible answer, and that is that when COVID hit, they spent immediate energy to turn this into a Trump issue, that the whole virus was a way to get at the president and destabilize his reelection chances. And one of the tactics was to scare people to death. And that's why you have scolds running around with tape measures in grocery stores that I've written about, yelling at people. And I think that that was a concerted effort to scare people. And then suddenly they're riding the tiger and they can't let go. And they realize that their voters are too scared to go vote in person. And now they have to spend federal money and philanthropic money to compensate for scaring their base to death that they can't vote in person. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. And the one thing I would say about this is there's two factors here. And again, you can see this in the proposed bills to deal with COVID-19, for example, the Nancy Pelosi dropped. They saw COVID-19 as an opportunity to get all of the election changes that they wanted and they've been pushing for years, such as getting rid of voter ID. That's got nothing to do with dealing with COVID-19 whatsoever. But the second thing is, and this is very unfortunate, look, I just published a Heritage paper on, it's a case study of 4 absentee ballot fraud cases. These are cases in which people were convicted, in which elections were overturned. And the common factor you find in all of these cases where there's large-scale absentee ballot fraud is that the folks in the conspiracy, who they prey on? They prey on people who are poor, the elderly, minority voters, and others who they believe they can coerce and pressure to vote a particular way, or as one particular guy said who was convicted in Troy, New York, where they picked on a low-income housing neighborhood. He said, well, these are the people who they believed would be least likely to complain about their vote being stolen. And I think that is unfortunately part of what is going on here in trying to change the rules and switch to as much mail-in balloting as possible.
And I think voter suppression, allegations of voter suppression, it's a political strategy. It's a way of waving the red flag. It's based on an ideology that the right to vote is the most sacred right we possess, but yet no one can be expected to exercise any responsibility whatsoever with respect to that. Any type of ballot security measure, any type of thing that tends to bring regularity to an election is going to require voters to do something. I mean, registration itself requires voters to do something. But I think all of this has been recast as voter suppression. And I think it is a political strategy, and we see that in the narrative about the post office now, which is something that, you know, if you give it even the slightest examination, you know, it falls apart. I mean, there's really nothing to it.
Let's go to this question from Robert Alt from Ohio, obviously another very important state. Robert asked, what's the most important thing, the single most important thing that viewers could do to help ensure the integrity of elections between now and Election Day?
Well, I think Christian mentioned at the end of his talk is try to be a poll worker in your neighborhood, working in the polls as someone who can help enforce the laws. And part of that is, look, right now election officials are making the decisions on how many polling places are they going to have open, how they're going to handle the election, and people need to be calling local officials, both in the county election department, their state legislators and others, and insisting that polling places be open, that they have a right to vote in person to cast their ballot, and they need to be pushing them to do that rather than trying to switch to this kind of universal all-mail election system.
One important postscript to what Hans just said, it's important to understand the difference between a poll worker and a poll observer. What he's talking about is being the official, not a party representative, not a candidate representative. Be the person with the power. That's the important part.
Yeah.
Be the person making decisions, not advocating for decisions.
Rick, any comments?
I agree with all of that. I think I think it's important for all of us not to buy into this notion that any effort at all to enforce the rule of law and to have reasonable ballot security measures is, some type of effort at voter suppression or the maintenance of white supremacy or whatever other sort of overwrought allegations are made. I think that it's important for us to understand that to vote is a right, to vote is a responsibility, and efforts to ensure that it is exercised in accordance with the law are something that are to be welcomed and not maligned.
Real quick, Rick, I have to mention on that voter suppression thing, I have for a couple of years now offered a $500 gift card bounty to anybody who can find the term voter suppression in federal law. It's a made-up term that blends together legal activity with illegal activity to smear people. It does not exist in federal law. There is no voter suppression federal statute. It's a made-up term on the left. And if you can find one in the federal code, you get a $500 gift card from me.
Let's go to a question from Henry Olson. Henry asks, what would you do to ascertain after the fact whether mass voter fraud occurred? And how can conservatives uncover where this takes place?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because the Public Interest Legal Foundation has been building a database for the last year plus, collecting public information about this, Henry, and we should have an announcement in the next 2 weeks. What we did is we looked at all the voter rolls, we cross-referenced them with commercial data, death data, duplicate data. We've got names of people who are voting twice in same state elections. I mentioned Rashawn Slade. Rashawn didn't commit a crime, but he was registered to vote 7 times in Pennsylvania, and that's not an outlier. We have that all over the country, not always 7 times, but more than once. And so, Henry, stay tuned. You'll be hearing more about that in the next few weeks.
I will add, it is extremely difficult to detect this kind of fraud after an election. Usually you only have if you're a candidate, you only have a very short time to contest the election. Again, one of the case studies that I talk about in my paper, the judge in that particular case is a case out of Indiana, another one out of Miami, talked about how difficult it is to investigate these kind of cases, because one of the only ways you can do it is to individually interview voters. It's extremely hard. And the other problem here is that even when you uncover it, all too often prosecutors and election officials aren't interested in doing about it. Just one quick example of this. After the 2016 election, another great organization, the Government Accountability Institute down in Florida, they compared the voter registration and voter history databases of a number of states. They found 8,500 individuals who had illegally voted in more than one state in the 2016 election. Not a single election official and not a single prosecutor in any of the states that they talked about in their report contacted them and asked for the names of those individuals so they could, 1, take them off the voter list, and 2, investigate them for possible prosecution. If they had, our database, which now has about 1,300 cases, probably would have had over 10,000 cases, but they didn't do anything about it.
Rick, we've had a tough time in Wisconsin after the fact, haven't we?
Yeah, I was thinking, I think it was the 2004 election cycle, Rick, where I was at a polling place, and at one point there were 8 lawyers at this single polling place. It was $5,000 an hour in top scale legal services being provided. And the reality is that there could have been people cheating left and right, and nobody would have been able to discern what that was. There have been attempts after the fact to look for anomalies. This is particularly important in a state like Wisconsin, where we have same-day registration, where you're able to register to vote and cast a ballot with what I think everyone has to agree is easily fabricated proof of residence. Now, I actually think that one of the values of photo ID is it makes it hard to effectuate that scheme to its end, but doesn't make it impossible. And what happens, and we had a report by the Milwaukee Police Department in 2008, and a lot of abuse was heaped on that report. But you got to look for anomalies. You have to look for things that make no sense. When postcards are sent out and people are asked to confirm that they vote and the postcards don't come back, it's not necessarily a clerical error, right? It could mean that something went wrong. And once again, the most important thing for all of us is to understand that an attempt to check that on the back end, even if it isn't something that will result in the invalidation of an election, is something that gives important information about what happened and what type of rule changes we need to make going forward.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Another good question from Andrew. Andrew asks, do you think because of all the hysteria on both sides of the aisle that no matter who wins, a large swath of voters will not see the election as legitimate, even if the winner is announced in a timely fashion? Rick, go for it.
That may happen, particularly if the election is close. I was saying one of the things that we need to figure out is whether an election is beyond the margin of fraud or beyond the margin of litigation. Most of them are, but some of them aren't. And I used to teach election law, and one of the things that you used to be able to do, I don't know if the link is still alive, is you could look at the New York Times Consortium's recount of Florida in 2000. And there is a scenario in Florida, and it's a likely scenario. You pick what kind of ballots you want to count, dimple Chad, pregnant Chad, however you want to do it. But a very reasonable counting scenario shows that George Bush won Florida by 2 votes in 2000. So one guy who staggered into the voting booth on election day decided who was going to be president of the United States. And so I think if the election is close like that, particularly if we don't adhere to the rules that were written beforehand, and I think there is some likelihood that that people are not going to accept it because look what happened. 2004. The election wasn't all that close, and yet there were still Democrats who wouldn't accept the fact that that Bush had been reelected, making up stories about Diebold machines and that type of thing. So it's a real problem.
No, I agree. I agree with what Rick said.
Maybe this will be the last question. We'll see. It might be a Hans question. The question is, can you address issues with voting machine coding fraud?
Yeah, look, I know there's a lot of folks out there who worry about that. What I will say is that so far, there hasn't been a single case proven. Some years ago, there were allegations that were actually investigated down in Florida in a congressional race that basically claimed that the electronic voting machines had been tampered with to change the outcome of an election. And those machines, I think, were examined in that investigation. They were unable to show that had actually occurred. I guess what I would say about this is my concern is actually more with not electronic voting machines. What I would be concerned about more with is making sure that county election officials don't have their central computers, the ones that actually total up the numbers that they're getting from all the precincts. Those should not be tied into the regular network that a county government has to allow hackers to get into it from outside. That's my biggest concern. As long as they're not doing that, as long as it is separate from the regular network, I guess I'm not too concerned about that issue. I would also point out that while we do have electronic voting machines in jurisdictions across the country, the vast majority of folks these days vote with an OptiScan ballot. You know, that's a paper ballot where you fill in the bubble next to the person's name. It is then put into a ballot box after being scanned to count the vote. But if there's any questions about the software being used in the computer scanner to count the vote, you've got the actual ballots. And so it's got a great audit trail. And some states are switching to electronic voting machines that actually print out the ballot after you've made the choices. So again, those are good because they have an audit trail. It's something we should be on the lookout for and take precautions about. But so far, there hasn't been any evidence that hackers have been able to get into any of the electronic systems we use for casting votes or counting votes to change the outcome of an election.
Thanks, Hans. We are at the top of the hour and regrettably out of time. Thanks so much to our panelists for a really informative event. A reminder that recording of this event will post in 48 hours. Encourage you to visit the heritage.org/events webpage to enjoy this and other webinars. And I really do hope that the last hour inspires everyone to take action to protect the integrity of our elections in November. Take care and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.